Title: The Forgotten Code. Chapter 1. The Download. The dull hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in Liam's small, cluttered room. He lay on his bed, scrolling mindlessly through app listings on his phone. It had been another long day at college, and he was restless, needing something to take his mind off the monotony. Nothing caught his interest. It was all the same social media platforms, boring games, and productivity apps he'd seen 1,000 times before. But then, something unusual appeared. At first glance, it looked like any other app. Simple black icon with a cryptic title, Forgotten Code. Beneath it, the tagline read, "Explore your deepest fears. Play if you dare." Curious, he tapped on the app's details. There were only a few reviews, each one vague and strange. One read, "It knows things. Scary things." Another simply said, "Don't download this." He hesitated, feeling a chill creep up his spine, but dismissed it as his imagination. "It's just a game," he told himself. He hit download, and the app installed almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for him. The icon settled on his home screen, pulsing faintly. Opening the app, Liam was greeted by a plain black screen with a single line of text. "Welcome, Liam." He froze. The app shouldn't know his name. There were no login prompts, no permissions requested. He glanced around the room, as if expecting to find someone watching him. His gaze fell back to the phone. Another message appeared. "Ready to play?" A choice appeared below, yes or no. His thumb hovered over the screen, a sense of dread building. He knew he should delete it, forget this ever happened, but he felt strangely compelled, as though some invisible force urged him to press yes. He took a deep breath and tapped yes. Immediately, the screen changed. It displayed a dark maze, dimly lit as though from a dying flashlight, with thick shadows pooling in the corners. In the center of the screen, a character icon flickered, a simple, pale figure that somehow felt unsettling, as if it were watching him through the screen. Liam tried to guide the character through the maze by swiping on the screen. The controls were responsive, smooth, and as he moved the figure through narrow corridors, he noticed details he hadn't expected. Small, eerie details. There were scratch marks on the walls, strange symbols etched into the ground, and the distant sound of faint breathing, as if someone or something was lurking just out of sight. After a few minutes, he reached the end of the maze. A single door appeared on the screen, barely visible, covered in scratches. As he moved closer, another message popped up. "The door opens if you're ready for the truth." He hesitated. Something about the message seemed ominous, as though it were more than just a game prompt. But again, curiosity overpowered caution, and he tapped to open the door. The screen went dark, his phone silent for several seconds, leaving him with his own quickening heartbeat. Just as he considered turning off the phone, a new message appeared. "Welcome to your nightmare, Liam." Suddenly, his phone's screen flickered, and the front camera activated without warning. He saw his own face staring back at him, wide-eyed, disoriented, and in the dark reflection, he thought he saw something behind him. Just a faint shadow, almost invisible. But when he turned, nothing was there. The camera clicked off, and another message popped up. "I see you." A shiver ran down his spine. He tried to close the app, but it wouldn't respond. His phone had locked into the app, freezing him in place. His heart pounded as he tapped the screen, frantically swiping, pressing the home button, but nothing worked. The phone's screen darkened once more, and text appeared, glowing faintly in the dim room. "You started the game. Now you must finish it." Then, the phone unlocked, returning him to the home screen as if nothing had happened. The app icon sat there innocently, as though it hadn't just trapped him in some kind of digital nightmare. Liam tossed his phone onto the bed, his hands shaking. He told himself it was just a creepy gimmick, an elaborate prank meant to unnerve users. Yet a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw shadows shifting at the edges of his vision, heard faint whispers in the silence. It was as if something were there with him, watching, waiting for him to make the next move. In the early hours of the morning, unable to resist, he picked up his phone again, scrolling back to Forgotten Code. He stared at the icon, his fingers trembling. Another notification popped up on the screen, despite his phone being on silent mode. We're not done yet. He felt an unnatural pull, as if the app itself were calling to him. Against his better judgment, he tapped on it. The app opened immediately, displaying a new message. The game has only just begun, Liam. A single button appeared at the bottom of the screen. Continue. This time, he couldn't bring himself to press it. He went to the settings, trying to delete the app, but the option was grayed out. He tried to restart the phone, but it wouldn't turn off. It was as if the app had taken over his device, trapping him in this twisted game. The phone buzzed, and a text message from an unknown number appeared. No running away. You belong to us now. Panic surged through him, and he threw the phone onto the floor, backing away as if it were a venomous creature. The screen dimmed, and for a moment, the room fell silent. Then, the phone rang. The caller ID read unknown, but something in him knew. It was the app calling. He hesitated, his breath shallow. His hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and he picked up the phone, pressing it to his ear. The line was filled with static, but beneath it, he could make out a faint, distorted voice. I see you, Liam, it whispered, the voice low and filled with a malice he'd never heard before. There's nowhere left to hide. He dropped the phone, stumbling backward, his heart pounding. The screen went dark, the call ending abruptly, and the phone lay silent once more. But the fear stayed with him, settling deep in his bones, a cold reminder that whatever he'd unleashed was far from over. In a last act of desperation, he picked up his phone and turned it off completely, removing the battery, hoping to cut off any connection to the app. He shoved the phone into a drawer, covering it with clothes, trying to bury it away, as if that could make the nightmare go away. But as he lay in bed, trying to convince himself it was over, he heard a faint buzzing sound from the drawer. The phone had turned on by itself. He lay there, paralyzed, staring at the drawer as the sound grew louder, relentless, like a heartbeat drumming in the quiet of his room. Chapter 2. The First Signs. The buzzing from Liam's phone grew louder, its sound cutting through the silence of his dark room like an unwelcome alarm. He lay there, frozen, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching him. A bead of cold sweat trickled down his forehead. He thought of ignoring the phone, of leaving it in the drawer, unopened and unanswered. But something stronger, a pull he couldn't explain, compelled him to reach for it. Slowly, he slid out of bed, every step measured, his heart pounding with each inch he drew closer to the drawer. The air was thick with tension, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the drawer handle. Finally, he took a deep breath and yanked it open. The screen was on, though he'd shut it down and removed the battery. His hands shook as he picked it up, staring at the lit screen, where a single word displayed in dark, ominous text. Ready? Before he could react, the screen flickered, and the app launched itself, the stark black icon opening to reveal a new message. You've started the game, Liam. Now, it's time to play. He swallowed, his hands trembling as he tried to turn the phone off again, but it wouldn't respond. The screen remained fixed on the message, unwavering. Then, the screen shifted, displaying a dimly lit maze, but this one looked different from the one he'd seen before. It looked like an exact replica of his house. A shiver ran down his spine as he stared at the familiar layout, the dim corridors leading through his living room, the staircase, even the small details of the pictures on the walls. He watched, horrified, as the figure he controlled in the game stood at the entrance, identical to his front door. The character in the game didn't move. It was waiting for him. Without thinking, Liam's finger slid over the screen, and the character began to walk forward, making his way through the narrow hallway. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow as he navigated the figure through his virtual home. Every step felt tense, like something was lurking just out of sight. The character reached the living room, and suddenly the screen flashed with static, and another message appeared. I see you. The camera activated again, displaying his own terrified reflection. But this time, he saw something else. Another shadow just over his shoulder, a twisted, dark shape that seemed to loom over him. He whipped around, heart pounding, but the room behind him was empty. He looked back at his phone, his hands trembling as he continued guiding the character through the dark maze of his house. The screen flickered with static, and his flashlight dimmed, leaving only a narrow beam of light. It felt suffocating, the darkness closing in, pressing against him. Another message popped up, the text jagged and distorted. "Are you alone, Liam?" The question made his skin crawl. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen, couldn't stop himself from playing. He guided the character up the stairs, his movements slow, cautious, dreading what he might find. As the character reached the top, the screen flickered again, and this time, the camera turned on by itself. He saw his own room, the walls lined with shadows, the dim light casting eerie shapes across the floor. And then, he saw it. A figure in the corner, barely visible, its eyes hollow, staring directly at him through the screen. His heart skipped a beat, his blood running cold as he dropped the phone, stumbling back. The figure seemed to disappear the moment he looked away, leaving only the empty room behind. But when he picked up the phone again, another message awaited him. "You can't escape me, Liam." Panic surged through him. He threw the phone onto his bed, breathing heavily, his mind racing. He'd had enough. This was more than just a creepy app. It was something sinister, something alive. He grabbed his jacket, fumbling with his keys, desperate to get out of the house, to escape the suffocating presence that seemed to lurk in every shadow. He rushed out into the night, the cold air hitting his face, a momentary relief from the oppressive feeling that clung to him like a second skin. He walked quickly down the street, his footsteps echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Every now and then, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure following him, lurking in the shadows. After a few minutes, he stopped beneath a street lamp, taking deep, shaky breaths, trying to calm himself. He took out his phone, fully intending to delete the app to rid himself of this nightmare once and for all. But when he unlocked the screen, his heart sank. The app was already open, and the screen displayed a live feed of his location, the camera showing the empty street in front of him. The words, "I see you," flashed across the screen, followed by another chilling message, "You can't run." He turned around, but the street was empty. The houses were dark, the streets silent, yet the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. His grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He swiped through his apps, frantically trying to delete forgotten code, but the option was grayed out, inaccessible. He looked back at the screen, and this time, the figure was there again, its dark form filling the camera feed, standing mere inches behind him. It was tall, with long twisted limbs, its face obscured by shadow. But its eyes were hollow, empty, as if it were staring straight into his soul. He stumbled back, almost dropping the phone, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He spun around, but the street was still empty. He was alone, or so he thought. The phone buzzed, and a new message appeared. "Don't turn around." The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill washed over him. His mind screamed at him to run, to get away, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. He held his breath, his heart pounding as he felt a cold, invisible presence close in around him, as though something were standing right behind him, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Slowly, he forced himself to look down at the phone, praying that the screen would be blank, that this was all some kind of twisted dream. But there, on the screen, he saw himself, his own terrified face staring back at him, his eyes wide with fear, and over his shoulder, barely visible, was the figure, its hollow eyes locked onto him, its twisted smile widening. Another message appeared. "There's no escape, Liam." With a strangled cry, he turned and ran, sprinting down the street, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. He didn't stop, didn't look back. His only thought was to get as far away as possible. The phone buzzed in his hand, the screen flashing with each step, but he ignored it, too terrified to see what new horror awaited him. He reached a nearby park, collapsing onto a bench, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. He looked down at the phone, half expecting to see the figure's face staring back at him. But the screen was blank. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The phone buzzed one last time, and a final message appeared. "It doesn't matter where you run, Liam. I will always find you." As he sat there, trembling, he felt the shadows around him shift, felt the weight of the darkness pressing in. And in that moment, he knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The shadows close. In the cold night air weighed heavily around Liam, thick and still. His steps felt hollow on the empty street as he clutched his phone, trying to make sense of what had happened. The shadows stretched long and unnaturally along the road, their dark tendrils seeming to reach out, clinging to his form. He fought the urge to look over his shoulder, fearing what might be lurking just beyond his sight. The unsettling messages, the figure in the app knowing his name, all of it haunted his thoughts, pressing down on his sanity like a vice. Forgotten code felt more like a curse than a game, and he was no longer sure he could control it. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he looked down at his phone, half hoping it would stay dark and silent. But a sudden buzz shattered the silence. Liam flinched, nearly dropping the phone as the screen lit up with a message. His blood ran cold as he read the text. "Still running." It was from the app, the same chilling font that seemed to stare into his soul, a taunt that dared him to defy it. He tried to close the app, pressing the buttons and swiping frantically, but the screen wouldn't respond. The app was stuck open, its dark maze filling the display, the layout identical to his neighborhood. His own house loomed at the edge of the maze, each path echoing the turns he would have to take to reach his front door. Liam's mind raced. The game had somehow mirrored his own world, its layout shifting and adapting to his surroundings. It felt like the app was tightening its grip on him, weaving itself into his reality. But he had no choice. He had to go home, to confront whatever was happening and break free from its influence. Taking a deep breath, he started walking, his steps echoing in the quiet night. Every so often, he would glance down at his phone, watching the character in the app mirror his movements through the maze. Each street, every turn, it all matched the world around him perfectly, as if the game were mapping out his life, one step at a time. As he reached the corner near his house, another message appeared on the screen. "Welcome home, Liam." A chill washed over him. He stopped in his tracks, looking around. The street was empty, the houses dark, their windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the app, watching as the character moved in sync with him. But as he approached his house, the character on the screen stopped, standing perfectly still at the foot of his driveway. Liam's breath caught in his throat as he felt a presence, a cold, silent weight hovering over him. The character in the game turned its head, slowly, until its empty, hollow eyes seemed to look directly at him. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet as he felt a surge of terror wash over him. Another message appeared. "Go inside, Liam." He shook his head, fear clawing at his mind. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave this cursed place, to abandon the game that had entwined itself into his life. But something held him in place, a force he couldn't shake. It was as if the app had woven itself into his very being, an unbreakable bond that wouldn't let him escape. The phone buzzed, and he watched in horror as the character on the screen stepped forward, mirroring his own reluctant steps. Slowly, Liam approached his front door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The house loomed over him, dark and silent, as though it had been waiting for him to return. He pushed the door open, stepping into the quiet, shadow-filled hall. The air was thick, oppressive, carrying a faint scent of something damp and decayed, as if the house itself had been abandoned for years. He closed the door behind him, his fingers still trembling, and the silence pressed in on him, suffocating. Another message appeared on the screen, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Go to your room, Liam." He glanced up the stairs, dread pooling in his stomach. The shadows seemed to shift, pooling around the edges of the staircase. Waiting, taking a deep breath, he ascended, each step creaking beneath his weight. He could feel the app's influence, a chilling presence that filled every corner of the house. As he reached the top of the stairs, he saw his bedroom door standing slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hall. His heart hammered in his chest as he approached, his pulse quickening with each step. He pushed the door open, stepping inside, and froze. His bedroom looked the same as ever, but something was wrong. The air was heavy, and a strange shadow lingered in the corner of the room, darker than any shadow should be. It seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, shifting in the faint light. He glanced down at his phone, half expecting another message, but the screen displayed only the dark, twisted maze. His character was standing in his room, a perfect replica, its hollow eyes staring back at him. Another message appeared. "Turn around, Liam." He hesitated, fear gripping him, his skin prickling. Slowly, he looked over his shoulder, his heart pounding. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness, stood the figure, the same dark, twisted presence he'd seen in the app, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his phone as he tried to move away, but his legs felt heavy, as though the shadows were holding him in place. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step filled with a malevolent intent. The air grew colder, the room darker, and Liam felt as though he were drowning in fear, unable to breathe, unable to move. The phone buzzed in his hand, and he glanced down, seeing a new message. "There's no escape, Liam." He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure drew closer, its hollow eyes boring into him, pulling him into the depths of its darkness. He could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that seeped into his bones, filling him with a terror he couldn't shake. The phone buzzed again, the screen flashing with another message. "You're mine now." In a final act of desperation, Liam lunged for the door, throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway. The shadows seemed to follow him, stretching out from his room, reaching for him as he fled. He raced down the stairs, his mind screaming at him to escape, to get as far from the house as possible. He burst through the front door, stumbling out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The street was silent, empty, but he could still feel the presence, watching him, waiting. He glanced down at his phone, hoping that the app would be gone, that this nightmare would end. But the screen was still lit, the app open, and a final message awaited him. "You can run, but you can't hide." The screen went dark, leaving him alone in the silence, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning, that the app had marked him, claimed him, and no matter where he went, it would find him. And as he stood there, shivering in the cold, he could have sworn he heard a faint whisper in the darkness. "See you soon, Liam." Chapter 4. The Endless Game. Liam felt trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. The quiet street, his house, even the air around him seemed steeped in an oppressive darkness. No matter how many times he tried to delete forgotten code or force his phone to shut down, the app would reappear, taunting him with cryptic messages and twisted images. He couldn't escape it. Wherever he went, he could feel the app's presence, an invisible force pressing down on him, binding him. Every attempt to sever its hold only made its influence stronger, tightening around him like invisible strings. His heart pounded as he looked down at his phone, the screen flickering with new messages that appeared, each more disturbing than the last. "Ready for the next level, Liam?" He didn't dare respond. But just as he resolved to ignore it, his phone screen changed, displaying another maze. This one was far more complex, its layout dark and convoluted, filled with twists and turns that seemed to stretch on forever. Against his will, he began guiding the character through the maze. Each step seemed to take him deeper into the app's sinister world, every corner hiding shadows that twisted and moved in unnatural ways. Then, something changed. The character in the game paused at a turn, and, as Liam watched, it looked up as though sensing something beyond the screen. The figure's hollow eyes fixed on him, staring straight through him. He dropped the phone, stumbling back as a cold fear seized him. The character's face had looked just like his own. His phone buzzed, another message appearing. "Are you running, Liam?" He wanted to scream, to throw the phone away and run as far as he could, but something stopped him. The app had a hold on him, something deeper than just fear. It was like a piece of him had been captured within the game, trapped in its twisted digital maze. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath, willing himself to calm down. When he opened them again, he looked at his phone, preparing to close the app, but it had already opened itself again. This time, the maze wasn't just an abstract series of corridors and walls. It was his house, rendered in disturbing detail. Every room, every hallway, every corner. It was all there, drawn in eerie, pixelated graphics. And the figure stood in the center, staring back at him, motionless. Another message flashed across the screen. "Come inside, Liam." The word sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced around his house, his gaze lingering on the darkened hallway. The silence was thick, pressing down on him like a weight, as though the very walls were listening, waiting. With a reluctant hand, he pressed a button on the screen, guiding the character down the digital hallway that mirrored his own. The shadows seemed to close in around the figure, and the whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. The character reached his room. Liam's breath caught as he watched, his eyes wide, his pulse racing. The room in the game was identical to his own, down to the smallest detail. The figure turned, and Liam felt as though it were looking directly at him. "It's not just a game, Liam." He froze. This message was different, more personal. It felt as though the app were speaking to him, taunting him. His mind raced with questions, fear twisting his thoughts. He felt like he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and the app was urging him to jump. He took a step back, his heart pounding, as the screen flickered and another message appeared. "You can't hide." As he stared at the screen, he became aware of a faint movement in his peripheral vision. He turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Only shadows, stretching across the walls, shifting and writhing as though alive. Then the lights in his house flickered. The shadows grew darker, pooling around him, and a chill filled the air. He glanced back at his phone, dread clawing at his chest. The screen displayed a new message. "Turn around, Liam." He swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore it, to look away, but he couldn't resist. Slowly he turned, his gaze meeting the empty darkness of the hallway. For a moment there was nothing. Then he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, its hollow eyes gleaming faintly in the darkness. It stood at the end of the hallway, motionless, watching him. He felt paralyzed, his mind racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure took a step forward, and Liam stumbled back, his phone slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. He didn't dare look away from the figure, fear rooting him in place. As it drew closer, he saw its twisted features, the hollow, empty eyes, the grotesque smile that seemed to stretch far too wide. It was the same figure he had seen in the app, the same entity that had haunted him since he first downloaded Forgotten Code. The lights flickered, and the figure was gone, leaving only the silence and the darkness. He stumbled back, grabbing his phone with shaking hands, and tried to delete the app one last time. But the option was still grayed out, mocking him, refusing to let him escape. The screen flashed, and a final message appeared. "You belong to me now, Liam. Forever." The screen went dark, leaving him alone in the silent, empty house. But he knew he was no longer alone. Somewhere in the shadows, it was waiting, watching, and he was trapped in its endless game. Chapter 5. The shadows deepen. Liam couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were closing in around him, as if every corner of his life had been touched by darkness. Even in his own home, the walls seemed to pulse, the shadows flickering in ways that made his skin crawl. Forgotten Code might have vanished from his phone, but its presence lingered, as if it had woven itself into his very mind. Every night since the app had disappeared, Liam's sleep was plagued by twisted dreams. Each one took him back to that maze, the endless corridors lined with his own distorted reflections. In the dreams, He could hear whispers all around him, his own voice, taunting him, daring him to go further into the darkness. One night, he awoke drenched in sweat, the echoes of the dream still ringing in his ears. He had been standing in a hall of mirrors, watching as his reflection's face twisted into a mocking smile, its eyes hollow, staring straight through him. The image clung to his mind like a stain, an imprint he couldn't erase. In the days that followed, strange occurrences began to plague him. At first they were subtle, his phone buzzing only to reveal no notifications, his reflection in mirrors seeming just slightly off, as though it were delayed by a fraction of a second. But soon, the incidents grew more unsettling. He'd see movement in his peripheral vision, dark shapes slipping through the edges of his sight, only to vanish when he turned his head. He would hear faint whispers, calling his name, filling his mind with doubts, fears, memories of the maze. Each day, he felt more and more as if the walls were closing in on him, trapping him in a nightmare he couldn't escape. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, he felt a sudden chill, like a cold breath brushing against the back of his neck. He froze, every nerve in his body on edge. The room felt wrong, as if it had taken on a life of its own. The phone on his coffee table buzzed, the sound jarring him out of his frozen state. He reached for it, dread pooling in his stomach as he looked at the screen. There was a notification from an unknown number. "Do you remember the maze, Liam?" His heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out over his skin. He stared at the message, the words blurring as fear took hold. He tried to delete it, to ignore it, but the message wouldn't go away. His phone screen flickered, then went dark. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room, a suffocating quiet that pressed down on him, wrapping around him like a shroud. Then, the phone buzzed again. A new message appeared, the letters jagged, dripping with malice. "It's time to come back." His hand trembled as he tried to turn off the phone, but it wouldn't respond. The screen flickered, and then the app's icon reappeared, pulsing faintly, taunting him. He knew he should throw the phone, run, do anything but open it, but something compelled him. Against his better judgment, he tapped the icon. The familiar dark maze filled his screen, its endless corridors twisting and turning, inviting him in. But this time, the image felt different, more vivid, as though he were looking through a window rather than a screen. A message appeared on the screen. "Find yourself, Liam." The words sent a chill down his spine. He didn't understand what the app wanted, but he knew he had no choice but to play. He guided the character forward, each step taking him deeper into the maze, the shadows growing darker, thicker, wrapping around him. He turned a corner, and there, standing in the middle of the corridor, was his own reflection. It looked at him with hollow eyes, its face twisted into a smile that was both familiar and terrifying. The reflection took a step forward, and Liam felt a surge of fear, his hand freezing on the screen. The figure in the game mirrored his every move, as though it were waiting for him to make a mistake. Another message appeared. "Do you fear what you see?" The reflection's face twisted, its mouth widening into a grin that seemed to stretch impossibly far, its eyes narrowing, filled with a darkness that felt alive. Liam's heart pounded, his breath coming in short gasps as he tried to pull away, but the app seemed to hold him in place, trapping him in the twisted reflection of himself. The figure began to speak, its voice low, echoing through the silence. "Do you know what you are, Liam?" it whispered, its tone mocking, taunting. "You are darkness. You are the maze." He stumbled back, dropping his phone in shock, but the screen didn't go dark. The character on the screen moved on its own, walking toward him, the twisted reflection growing closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Panicked, he grabbed the phone, trying to turn it off, but the screen remained frozen, the figure's face filling the display, its empty gaze piercing into him. "You can't hide from yourself," the reflection whispered. "You are the shadow." He tried to close the app, to escape the nightmare, but the screen wouldn't respond. The reflection grew larger, filling the screen, until it was all he could see. The room around him seemed to fade, replaced by darkness, the walls dissolving into shadows. And then, he found himself back in the maze. The phone was gone, the screen replaced by the cold, damp walls of the endless corridors. He was no longer a character in the game. He was himself, trapped within the dark, twisting maze, surrounded by shadows that moved and whispered, calling his name. Liam. Liam. The voices were everywhere, filling his mind, blending together into a haunting symphony. He ran, his footsteps echoing through the silence, but no matter how far he went, the shadows followed, shifting, twisting, becoming darker, more menacing. He turned a corner and froze. There, standing in front of him, was his own reflection, its eyes hollow, its face twisted into that same grotesque smile. "You can't escape, Liam," it whispered, its voice filled with malice. "We are one." The reflection lunged at him, and he felt a cold hand close around his throat, squeezing, suffocating. He tried to scream, to fight back, but his voice was lost in the darkness, swallowed by the shadows that wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the maze. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the nightmare ended. Liam found himself back in his apartment, gasping for breath, his heart pounding. The room was silent, empty, the shadows still. He looked at his phone lying on the floor, its screen dark and lifeless. But he knew, deep down, that the darkness had not left him. The maze, the shadows, the twisted reflection, they were all a part of him now, woven into his very being. He would carry them with him, always, a shadow that followed him, silent and unseen. And as he stood there, alone in the silence, he understood the truth. He was the maze, he was the shadow, and there was no escape. Chapter 6. Into the abyss. Liam felt himself spiraling, plunging into an endless darkness that seemed to close in on him from every direction. The walls of the maze had vanished, replaced by a void so complete that it swallowed everything, even his own sense of time and space. He didn't know where he was or how long he'd been falling. His mind reeled, struggling to hold on to any sliver of reality, but the darkness seemed to drain his thoughts, leaving only fear. He landed with a sudden, jarring impact, the shock of it ripping him out of his stupor. He lay still for a moment, his breath shallow, his heart pounding as he tried to process what had happened. His hands pressed against a cold, hard surface, but he couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of his phone, which lay beside him, flickering like a dying flame. Slowly, he picked it up, his fingers trembling as he unlocked the screen. The app was already open, displaying a new maze, one that looked even darker, even more twisted than before. The walls were closer together, the corridors narrow and winding, as though the maze itself were tightening around him. A message appeared on the screen, chilling him to the core. "Welcome to the final level, Liam." He felt a shiver run down his spine, his pulse quickening as he stared at the screen. The words felt final, like a sentence being passed down, a declaration that he was trapped, that there was no way out. He tried to close the app, but it wouldn't respond. The phone felt cold in his hand, almost like it was alive, pulsing with a sinister energy that seemed to seep into his skin. A new message appeared. "This is where you face yourself." Liam swallowed, his throat dry, his mind racing. He didn't understand what that meant, but he knew it wasn't good. The app had already shown him twisted versions of himself, reflections that mocked him, haunted him. He wasn't sure he could handle another encounter, but he had no choice. The app wouldn't let him leave, wouldn't let him escape this nightmare. He guided the character forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the weight of his fear had taken on a physical form, pressing down on him, dragging him down. The corridors twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the darkness, the walls closing in, suffocating him. Then, he heard it. A faint whisper, echoing through the maze, barely audible but unmistakable. It was his own voice, calling out to him, pleading, desperate. "Help me!" The sound sent a chill through him, a sense of dread pooling in his stomach. He didn't understand how it was possible, but the voice sounded real, as though a part of him were trapped within the app, lost in its twisted world, calling out for help. The whispers grew louder, filling the air, echoing through the maze, blending together in a haunting symphony. They overlapped, distorted, fragments of sentences that he couldn't fully understand, but that filled him with a deep, unshakable terror. He turned a corner, and the screen froze. For a moment, he thought the app had glitched, but then he saw it. A figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the darkness. It looked like him, but it was distorted, twisted, its features warped and unnatural. Its eyes were hollow, empty, staring back at him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the screen, reaching into his mind. A message appeared. "Face yourself, Liam." The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step echoing through the silence. Liam's heart pounded, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as he watched, unable to tear his eyes away. The screen flickered, and he saw a glimpse of his own face, twisted and distorted, staring back at him with a look of pure malice. The figure's mouth moved, forming words that he couldn't hear, but that he felt deep within his soul. Another message appeared. "You are me, and I am you." Liam stumbled back, his mind reeling as the words echoed through his thoughts. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt a deep, instinctual fear that told him to run, to get as far away from the figure as possible. But the maze stretched on endlessly, its walls pressing in on him, trapping him. He tried to guide the character away, but the app wouldn't respond. The figure continued to move closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its twisted smile widening. The screen flickered again, and he saw his own face, twisted with fear, staring back at him from the darkness. A final message appeared. "You cannot escape yourself." The figure reached out, its hand stretching through the screen, reaching for him. Liam screamed, dropping the phone, stumbling back as he felt a cold, clammy sensation brush against his skin. The shadows around him twisted, closing in, their dark forms writhing as though alive. He could feel the app's presence, pressing down on him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into its world. He tried to fight it, to resist, but it was no use. The darkness was all-encompassing, swallowing him whole. And in that final moment, as he felt himself slipping away, he realized the truth. He was the final level. Chapter 7. Reflections of Darkness. The silence around Liam was thick, pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. He felt as if he were drifting in a void, a darkness so complete that it erased any sense of direction or time. His phone screen glowed faintly in his hand, casting a cold blue light that barely illuminated his surroundings. He clutched it tightly, feeling as though it were his only anchor in this endless darkness. The maze had dissolved into shadows, and he felt a disorienting sense that he was no longer just playing the game. He was in the game. The walls of his reality had blurred, leaving only the twisted corridors of forgotten code, now infinitely more real and infinitely more terrifying. His phone buzzed, and a new message appeared on the screen. "Ready to face your own shadow, Liam?" He shuddered, his hand trembling as he read the message. A creeping fear whispered in the back of his mind, warning him that whatever lay ahead would be worse than anything he'd seen before. He took a shaky breath and forced himself to move forward. Every step he took echoed, hollow and unsettling, like footsteps trailing him. The corridor stretched on and on, twisting in ways that seemed unnatural, almost as though the path itself were alive and shifting to keep him within its grip. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the corridor ended, opening into a dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a large, cracked mirror, its surface dull and smudged, reflecting the faint glow of his phone. The air felt colder here, the shadows darker, as if they were drawn to the mirror. Liam stared at it, feeling an instinctual urge to turn away, to run, but he couldn't look away. As he took a step closer, the screen on his phone flickered, displaying a familiar image, a distorted version of his own face, twisted into a grotesque, mocking smile. The reflection in the mirror shifted as well, the shadows twisting to reveal his own face, staring back at him with hollow, soulless eyes. Another message appeared on the phone. "The darkness inside you knows no bounds." The words sent a chill through him, freezing him in place. He watched, horrified, as his reflection moved on its own, leaning forward, its hollow gaze piercing through him. He felt as though he were staring into a void, a bottomless pit of darkness that threatened to consume him. The reflection tilted its head, its eyes narrowing as it whispered, "Do you know who you really are, Liam?" He took a step back, his heart pounding, but the reflection moved closer, its hands reaching out, pressing against the inside of the glass. A faint, cracking sound echoed through the room, and Liam's heart raced as he realized the mirror was beginning to fracture. Each crack spread slowly across the glass, like spiderwebs, forming jagged patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The reflection's face twisted further, its features contorting into a monstrous grin. "Are you afraid of what's inside you?" it asked, its voice low, almost taunting. Liam's throat felt tight, his skin prickling with terror. He tried to turn away, but the reflection's voice followed him, whispering in his mind, echoing in the darkness. "You can't escape what you are, Liam," it said, its voice blending with his own, becoming indistinguishable. "You brought this upon yourself." The phone buzzed again, and he glanced down, dread pooling in his stomach as he read the new message. "The maze isn't just a game, Liam. It's a doorway to the darkest parts of you." The words sent a wave of nausea through him. He wanted to scream, to shout that it was all a lie, but deep down, a part of him feared it was the truth. The app wasn't just a curse, it was a reflection of something darker within himself, something he had kept hidden, buried beneath layers of denial and fear. The cracks in the mirror spread further, the reflection's hand pressing against the glass, its eyes filled with a dark, twisted glee. "Let me in, Liam," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "Let me show you who you really are." The lights in the room flickered, the shadows growing thicker, pressing in on him. He stumbled back, his mind racing, but the darkness seemed to wrap around him, pulling him closer to the mirror. He looked down at his phone, desperate for some way to break free, but the app had taken on a life of its own, displaying a distorted version of his face, its eyes hollow and empty. A final message appeared, etched across the screen in jagged letters. "Face yourself, or be consumed." The reflection in the mirror began to laugh, a hollow, echoing sound that filled the room, vibrating through the walls. It raised its hand, pressing harder against the glass, and Liam watched in horror as the mirror began to shatter, pieces falling away to reveal the darkness beyond. A hand emerged from the mirror, reaching for him, its fingers long and twisted, its skin pale and cold. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, but the hand continued to reach, its grip tightening around his mind, pulling him toward the mirror. He fought against it, his mind screaming in terror, but the darkness was relentless, wrapping around him like chains, dragging him closer. He could feel the cold seeping into his skin, his thoughts blurring, merging with the darkness. And then, as the hand closed around him, he heard the reflection's final chilling words. "Welcome to the abyss, Liam. You were always meant to join me." The world around him faded, dissolving into shadows, and he felt himself falling, sinking into the endless void, his own reflection consuming him, pulling him into the depths of his darkest fears. Chapter 8. The Lurking Darkness. Liam's reality seemed to fray at the edges, dissolving into darkness. He didn't know how much time had passed or even if time held any meaning here. He felt as though he were floating in an abyss, trapped between worlds, his mind unraveling as the shadows crept closer, feeding on his fear. He drifted, weightless, surrounded by a silence so complete it was suffocating. The last thing he remembered was the mirror, his twisted reflection reaching out, dragging him down, merging with him. Now he was nowhere, everywhere, lost in a sea of darkness. But then, a faint sound echoed through the void, a whisper, low and distorted, filled with malice. "Welcome, Liam." The voice made his blood run cold. It was his own voice, yet twisted, warped into something sinister, something other. He shuddered, clutching at his head, his fingers trembling as he tried to block out the sound. But the whispers continued, filling his mind, echoing through the emptiness. "You brought me here," it said, its tone mocking, taunting. "I am you, and you are me." Liam shook his head, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. He wanted to scream, to deny it, but he knew, deep down, that there was a dark truth in the words. The app, the maze, the reflection. All of it was a twisted reflection of something inside him, something he had long tried to ignore. He floated in silence, his mind racing as he tried to understand, to make sense of the nightmare that had become his reality. But the darkness was relentless, pressing down on him, wrapping around him like a shroud, filling him with a cold, gnawing terror. Then he felt it, a presence lurking in the shadows, watching him, waiting. It was close, so close he could feel its breath on his skin, cold and stale, reeking of decay. "Do you fear yourself, Liam?" the voice whispered, its tone dripping with malice. "Or do you fear what you have become?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The darkness pressed in, suffocating him, filling his lungs with cold, stale air. He felt as though he were drowning, sinking deeper into the abyss, his mind slipping away. But then, a faint light appeared in the distance, barely more than a flicker, yet it drew him, a beacon in the endless night. He reached for it, his fingers trembling, his heart pounding as he struggled to move, to pull himself toward the light. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the void, blending together into a haunting chorus. "Come closer, Liam," they called, their voices merging, becoming one. "Come home." He drifted toward the light, each step heavy, each movement a struggle. The darkness resisted, pulling him back, wrapping around him like chains, but he forced himself forward, driven by a desperate need to escape. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, illuminating the shadows, revealing twisted shapes that writhed and shifted, their hollow eyes fixed on him. He felt their gaze, cold and hungry, piercing into his soul, and he knew, without a doubt, that they were waiting for him, eager to consume him, to pull him into their world. But he continued forward, his heart pounding, his mind racing with fear and desperation. The light was close now, so close he could feel its warmth, its promise of escape. He reached out, his fingers brushing against it, feeling its warmth seep into his skin, chasing away the cold. But then, as he touched the light, it flickered, dimming, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The darkness surged forward, swallowing the light, consuming it, leaving him alone in the void once more. The whispers grew louder, their tone mocking, filled with a dark satisfaction. "You cannot escape, Liam," they said, their voices blending together, becoming one. "You are one of us now." He stumbled back, his heart pounding, his mind reeling as the truth settled over him. He was trapped, bound to the darkness, a part of it. The app, the maze, the reflection. It was all a manifestation of his own fears, his own darkness, and he knew deep down that he would never escape. But then, a new thought crept into his mind. A whisper, soft and faint, yet filled with a strange sense of hope. "What if you could control the darkness?" it asked, its tone gentle, almost reassuring. "What if you could make it yours?" He hesitated, his mind racing as he considered the possibility. The darkness was a part of him, a reflection of his own fears, his own weaknesses. But if he could confront it, control it, maybe he could find a way out. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself, focusing his mind, drawing on every ounce of strength he had left. He closed his eyes, blocking out the whispers, the shadows, the fear, and reached deep within himself, searching for the darkness, the part of him that had created this nightmare. The whispers grew louder, their tone desperate, as though they sensed his intent. "No, Liam," they cried, their voices filled with fear. "You cannot control us." But he ignored them, focusing his mind, drawing the darkness toward him, letting it wrap around him, filling him, becoming a part of him. He felt its weight, its coldness, but he also felt its power, its strength. He opened his eyes, and the shadows shifted, writhing, their hollow eyes wide with fear as they backed away, retreating into the darkness. A new message appeared on his phone. "Congratulations, Liam. You have embraced the darkness." He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a feeling of power he had never known. The maze was his now, its twisted corridors, its shadows. All of it belonged to him. He turned, his gaze piercing into the darkness, and for the first time he felt no fear. The shadows shrank back, their forms quivering, as though they recognized him as their master. He took a step forward, his heart steady, his mind clear, and the shadows parted, opening a path through the darkness, leading him toward the light. As he walked, he felt the maze dissolve around him, the walls fading, the shadows retreating, until he was alone, standing in the darkness, his phone in his hand. And then, as if by some final act of defiance, the app displayed one last message. You may have won, but you will never be free. The screen went dark, and he felt a chill wash over him, a reminder that the darkness would always be a part of him. But he smiled, knowing that he was no longer its prisoner. He had embraced the darkness, and in doing so, he had found his freedom. Chapter 9. The Lingering Shadow. Liam returned to his apartment in the early hours of the morning, feeling like he was walking through a fog. The city lights outside cast an eerie glow on his walls, and shadows danced across the room, taunting him with their shapeless forms. Though he had escaped the nightmare, the sensation of darkness lingered, pressing down on him with an invisible weight. He glanced around, half expecting to see a twisted version of himself standing in a corner, waiting, watching. But the room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only movement the fluttering curtains in the night breeze. It was quiet. Normal. Almost too normal. Yet he felt it. The darkness was still there, lurking, like a shadow that had fused with his very soul. Liam collapsed onto his couch, letting out a shaky breath. He pulled out his phone, which he hadn't dared to look at since his escape. Its screen was dark, lifeless. No app, no messages, nothing. He unlocked it cautiously, half expecting forgotten code to reappear. But the app was gone. He searched every folder, every corner of his phone, but it was as though it had never existed. Maybe it's really over, he whispered to himself, his voice filled with hope and disbelief. But even as he said the words, he felt a chill prickling the back of his neck, the sensation that someone was behind him. His phone buzzed suddenly, and he nearly dropped it. The message notification startled him, cutting through the silence like a blade. The message was from an unknown number. "Miss me, Liam." His heart pounded, dread filling his veins like ice water. He stared at the message, his fingers trembling as he hesitated, not daring to respond. He wanted to believe it was a prank, some residual trick from the app. But deep down, he knew the darkness wasn't done with him. A second message appeared, the letters cold and sharp. "You can't silence the shadows." He clutched the phone, his knuckles white, every instinct screaming at him to delete the message, to ignore it. But another part of him, the part that the app had twisted, the part that had embraced the darkness, compelled him to respond. He typed back, his fingers barely steady enough to hit the letters. "What do you want from me?" The reply was instant, as though the sender had been waiting, watching, to show you who you really are. A creeping chill washed over him, and he felt the walls of his apartment closing in. The familiar shadows taking on shapes, contorting into twisted forms that he could almost recognize as his own. He stood up, pacing the room, trying to shake off the sensation, but everywhere he looked, he saw hints of movement in the corners of his vision, shadows darting just out of sight. They moved as he moved, paused as he paused, as if mirroring his every step. "Get out of my head," he muttered, running his hands through his hair. "You're gone. I beat you." But the shadows only laughed, their voices blending together in a sinister harmony. "You invited us, Liam. We are part of you now." He slammed his hands over his ears, trying to drown out the sound, but it was no use. The laughter filled his mind, crawling into his thoughts, burrowing deep within. He could feel the darkness creeping through him, filling the empty spaces left by his fear, tainting his memories, his thoughts, even his dreams. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, to clear his mind. But when he opened them, he was no longer in his apartment. The walls around him had changed, shifting into dark, twisting shapes. The room was gone, replaced by a void, an endless expanse of shadows stretching out in every direction. He stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by twisted reflections of himself, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their faces contorted into grotesque smiles. "Welcome home," one of the shadows whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "Did you really think you could escape us?" Liam stumbled back, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He knew this place. It was the maze, the same endless labyrinth from the app. He had thought he'd left it behind, but it had followed him, clinging to him like a curse. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I broke free. It's just a dream." But the shadows laughed, their voices echoing through the void. "A dream?" they mocked. "This is no dream, Liam. You belong here. You always have." He ran, his footsteps echoing in the darkness, but the maze twisted around him, the walls shifting, trapping him. Every turn brought him face to face with another twisted version of himself, each one a darker, more corrupted reflection of who he was. He could hear the whispers growing louder, filling his mind with doubts, with fears, with truths he didn't want to confront. Each shadow taunted him, reminding him of every dark thought, every regret, every part of himself he had tried to bury. "You can't hide from us, Liam," one of the shadows whispered, its voice soft, sinister. "We are you." He stumbled, his vision blurring as the darkness closed in, pressing down on him, filling his lungs, his mind, his soul. He felt as though he were drowning, sinking into an endless sea of shadows, lost forever in the darkness. But then, a thought pierced through the fear, a small, faint spark of defiance. "No," he muttered, his voice shaking. "I beat you once. I can do it again." The shadows recoiled, their hollow eyes widening with fear, and he felt a surge of strength, a determination that burned through the darkness, lighting a path through the void. He stood up, facing the shadows, his gaze fierce. "You're just echoes," he said, his voice steady, filled with a newfound strength. "Fragments of my own fear. You don't control me." The shadows hissed, their twisted forms writhing, but they didn't move forward. He took a step closer, feeling the darkness retreat, shrinking back as he confronted it. "I am done running from you," he said, his voice resonating through the void. "I know who I am." The maze began to dissolve, the walls fading into nothingness as the shadows scattered, their hollow eyes filled with a mixture of fear and rage. One last shadow remained, standing in the center of the void, its face identical to his own. It stared at him, its expression unreadable, its eyes empty. "You will never be free of us, Liam," it whispered, its voice filled with a quiet, lingering menace. "We are a part of you, whether you want us or not." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe," he replied, his voice calm, resolute. "But I decide who I am." The shadow's face twisted, its form flickering, and with a final, silent scream, it faded into the darkness, leaving him alone in the silence. The void began to collapse around him, the shadows dissipating, replaced by the faint glow of his apartment. He blinked, disoriented, his mind reeling as he found himself back on his couch, his phone lying silent in his hand. The room was quiet, the shadows gone, the whispers silenced. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over him, a calmness that filled the empty spaces left by the darkness. He knew that he would never truly be free of the shadows, that they would always linger, waiting, watching. But he had faced them, confronted the darkness within himself, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his life. For the first time in weeks, he felt free. Liam stood, walking over to the window and looking out at the city below, bathed in the soft glow of dawn. The world felt new, fresh, as though he were seeing it for the first time. He took a deep breath, a small smile forming on his lips. The shadows might never leave him, but he had learned to live with them, to accept them as a part of who he was. And as he watched the sunrise, he felt a quiet, enduring strength, a reminder that he was more than his fears, more than the darkness that had once held him captive. Chapter 10. The Final Echo. Liam felt a weight lift as dawn broke over the city. The nightmare was over, he told himself, and with each passing second, He could feel the grip of forgotten code fading. But though the darkness no longer held his mind in its vice-like grip, a residual unease lingered. Like a faint echo, shadows clung to his thoughts, a reminder that they would always be part of him. For weeks, he went about his life with cautious optimism, gradually feeling the pieces of normalcy slip back into place. The phone stayed silent, the app was nowhere to be found, and the twisted reflections he'd once faced seemed like fragments of a bad dream. Yet, the memory of the shadowy maze, the whispers, the figures that had tormented him, they lingered, ever present, like scars etched onto his mind. One evening, as Liam was clearing out files on his computer, his phone buzzed. He froze, the sound sending a spike of panic through him. But when he looked at the screen, it was only a text from a friend. He exhaled, laughing to himself. "Get a grip, Liam," he muttered, feeling foolish for jumping at shadows. He silenced his phone and set it aside. But that night, as he drifted to sleep, he had the strangest dream. He found himself standing in his apartment, yet something was wrong. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching along the walls, twisting and writhing as though alive. He turned to the window, only to see a figure reflected in the glass, a figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. A chill crept down his spine as he realized it was himself. "Welcome back, Liam," the reflection whispered, its voice hollow, dripping with malice. He stumbled back, his heart racing as the reflection stepped closer, pressing against the glass. He could see his own face contorted in fear, his reflection's eyes gleaming with a dark, unnatural light. "Did you think you could escape us?" it asked, its voice filled with mockery. "We are a part of you, always waiting." The shadows in the room shifted, growing darker, stretching toward him like hands reaching out to pull him back into the abyss. He tried to run, but the darkness wrapped around him, holding him in place. "You belong to us," the reflection whispered, its voice echoing through the silence. "Forever." Liam woke with a start, his heart pounding, his skin damp with sweat. He glanced around the room, his pulse racing as he searched for any sign of the shadows. But his apartment was empty, silent, the shadows still. He let out a shaky breath, telling himself it was only a dream. But the feeling of dread lingered, and he couldn't shake the sense that the shadows were watching, waiting for him to let his guard down. For days, he was haunted by the dream, every shadow, every dark corner, a reminder of the darkness he had faced. He began to feel the maze again, its twisted corridors lurking just at the edges of his vision, as if calling to him, pulling him back. One evening, as he was closing his laptop, a notification popped up on his phone. He stared at the screen, his blood running cold as he saw the familiar icon, the dark, pulsing symbol of forgotten code. It flickered, taunting him, reminding him of the nightmare he had escaped. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his mind screaming at him to ignore it, to turn it off. But the app opened on its own, displaying a single message. "Ready to play again, Liam." He felt a surge of terror, his fingers shaking as he tried to close the app, but it wouldn't respond. The screen flickered, the words shifting, becoming sharper, more sinister. "You may have won the game," the app whispered, "but you are never truly free." A cold realization settled over him, a reminder that the darkness would always be there, lurking, waiting. He knew he could never fully escape it, that it would always be a part of him, a shadow that followed him, silent and unseen. The app closed, leaving his screen dark, but the message lingered, etched into his mind. He would move forward, live his life, but he would never forget. The darkness had marked him, leaving him with a reminder of the maze, the shadows, the reflections of himself he had faced. And as he stared into the quiet of his apartment, he knew that the final echo of forgotten code would stay with him forever.